about what a technology-enabled patient concierge mean to the rare disease in patients and to the orphan drugs industry. In this topic, I'll cover the need for patient registries, natural history studies, which are very important and critical prerequisite for all rare diseases. And for some of them, good registries already exist, and they are the good examples of what success looks like. But for many other rare diseases, there's still no patient registry or natural history study. And if they do exist, they may be predominantly localized to one country or one region. And so we need to look at each rare disease as a global public health issue and have these registries and access to information, access to resources, treatment, just like the previous speakers were highlighting that for Latin America, that's true for 90% of the world, as predominantly mostly United States, Europe, and Japan are the three regions where there is orphan drug development and regulatory approvals happening on some expedited level. So let me start by sharing a few disclaimers. I'm a rare dad myself, and that's what got me into rare disease patient advocacy. I'm a data scientist by training, worked all in precision medicine area. And these are my current affiliations. In addition to Indo, US Rare and Jiva, I'm an affiliate faculty at George Mason, Rare Disease Diversity Coalition, on the working committee, and on the board of directors of Greater Gift. So if you look at the journey of a patient with a rare disease, they remain undiagnosed for a long time, average of 5 to 7 years. And then once they receive a diagnosis, only 5% or 7% of the rare diseases have some FDA approved treatment now, with 1,100 orphan drugs approved approximately by the US FDA since the Orphan Drug Act of 1983. Patient may be diagnosed with a disease, but has no FDA approved treatment. This is the majority, right? More than 90% of the patients fall under this bucket. And if that's the case, the best thing that can happen is they enroll in an ongoing clinical trial for a new drug or treatment for that disease. And most of these clinical trials are located in urban areas, like it was just mentioned, and mostly in the United States and European Union. And the rest of the world is not as engaged in most of the clinical trials. And that's the big challenge for most patients globally. And then once they receive the treatment, there is long-term follow-up to monitor and the kind of surveillance to see how the patient outcomes are. So diagnosis is the need of the hour for patients in this stage. Getting into registry and natural history studies, if any, will be the priority in this stage. And the enrolling in a clinical trial in here are monitoring of their health and outcomes and looking out for what new options that become available. So overall, over 2,000 rare disease clinical trials are underway right now, and 90% of the population will not have access to these clinical trials just because of the location of where these trials are conducted. So I'll skip through that as an example of ALS only. But if you look at the overall process of drug development, this process is slow and inefficient, with 9 out of 10 candidate drugs that will fail during the clinical development process. Only one in 10 on an average will succeed. And so it's a highly risky undertaking that the biopharmaceutical companies and the orphan drug companies undertake. Now, as they get through this valley of death, once they come into the phase 1, about 1/3 of the drugs do not go to phase 2, and another third of the drugs fail there, and then about 10% of the drugs still fail even after phase 3. And so that's why this is called the valley of death, right? So now, how do we accelerate this process? On one hand, we have the orphan drug companies struggling to find and enroll patients. to join these clinical trials. On the other hand, there are patients in 90% of the population who have no chance of enrolling in these clinical trials, or at least make it extremely hard, right? Unless they are traveling and have a way to relocate or something, and still it may be not possible to enroll. That's the main problem that we are looking to address here. So if you look at the overall process, it's long and complex, takes on an average 8-9 years once a candidate drug gets into phase 1 clinical trials to get through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, submit to the FDA, receive an approval or not. So the industry is trying to bring this down significantly, but we can't speed up a lot, but there is an opportunity to bring from 8-9 years to 5 to 7 years. How do we do that? And the cost is also exorbitant right now because of the way numerous point solutions and the CRO site complex nature of these contracts. There is actually, we spent last 4.5 years at Jiva Informatics to ask why is this so inefficient? Why does it cost so much? And this is what we heard, right? So the key for since the 40th anniversary of Orphan Drug Act is this year, from 1983, it has been a game changer, right? So it has helped provide a lot of incentives to the orphan drug companies to invest in orphan drug development. And it's the patients who have a sense of urgency, right? They have their time ticking, and they need to get that treatment as quickly as possible. And so they can't wait, they can't accept delays, and they keep pushing the needle. And so that's what is necessary here. And so if you look at the volume of patients and data in registries, that's very key. Diversity, equity, inclusion, access, that also should include the rest of the world, the 90% of the population. Global access, affordable technology built for purpose, right? And early diagnosis is always critical. Without that, patients have no chance of finding or enrolling in a clinical trial. And then advocacy is a hallmark of rare diseases, because that's where we are, informing the legislators and the executive branches of the government on what is it that we really need, and also the industry. So that multi-stakeholder engagement. And critical part of this is organizing the data and translating stories into data, because of the orphan drug development is largely driven by data. And as US electronic medical records became prevalent from 2014, 2015 timeframe because of a government mandate. And similarly, in European Union, many countries have national health systems, and data is available to a great extent in digital format. But for the rest of the world, that's not true. And that's what is a important point I'd like to make here, is for low and middle income countries that want to get on the bandwagon for rare disease research and orphan drug development, we got to start building patient registries, digitizing the data, and we need to translate the patient stories into data. How do you collect and store? Where do you store this data, right? And so if you look at how research progresses from basic cell biology, molecular biology, to preclinical animal models and clinical and implementation to study the etiology, physiology, pathology, and therapy development, and developing public health guidelines, patients experience symptoms, and they are looking for diagnosis and access. Move a disease from this observation to intervention. That's what the product of scientific research is, ultimately that data that we collect, right? And so patient registries are organized system to collect uniform information with a defined purpose, target population, and method. So uniform information is data. So who do we collect that from, and what do we collect? It's the participant provided information or patients provided, and contact information, family history, medical history. but the clinicians provide the medical data for those patients. So we need both patient-reported and clinician-reported outcomes to create well-designed patient registries. So as you can see, as soon as you have a research agenda for a rare disease, patient registry or a natural history study becomes the foundation on which the rest of the building has to be constructed. And so not having this or not having representation of patients from across the world is a barrier for advancing many of the rare disease orphan drug development programs. As an example, you can see the ALS Registry Act of 2008 in the United States that led to the creation of a ALS patient registry. It took a legislative act to get the registry set up, right? Over the last 15 years, this registry has led to the enrollment of patients with ALS in 40 clinical trials. That's an enormous impact that this is, and this is managed by the Centers for Disease Control, which is a government of US entity. And it has numerous other benefits, but since then, there are a handful of efforts to create a ALS registry in Latin America, in and other countries, but it's still in some small populations. Much of the world is still not part of any registries or haven't set up the registry yet. And so there's systematic reviews which showcase how the American register and the 5 other registries that came about and where they stand, right? So the point I'm trying to highlight here is that the registries are so critical, yet they are not being invested. This is typically a less expensive effort, but less appreciated. Not everybody has the foresight and vision to understand that registries and natural history studies, even though may not be related to drug testing, is such a foundational aspect for orphan drug development. And that's the awareness we try to raise in helping set up with best practices from NIH and elsewhere, which have provided best practices for setting up of patient registries. So if you look at ALS as an example, you see that there's 195 active clinical trials right now, recruiting 137 recruiting and active and not recruiting, right? So just for one rare disease, ALS, there is 195 studies going on. And this is from clinicaltrials.gov database. So if you look at this, most of these trials are in United States and Europe, leaving the rest of the world unengaged to a great extent. While if you look at the human population, rare diseases are human issues. If you look at the human population, significant number of people live in India, China, and Asia. More than half of the world is in Asia, right? And then there is Latin America, Africa, and other countries which are less engaged. And if you look at the proportion of where clinical trials are conducted and the number of patients having an opportunity, it's massive inequity in how this works. And so what we need is, the sponsors and regulators understand this. And so the impact of patients and ensuring a good patient experience for remote patient engagement. FDA is, as a regulator, is requesting input from all patients on what is their experience with this particular rare disease. So they have patient listening sessions. They have something called patient-focused drug development sessions, where they collect comprehensive patient experience firsthand, where patients can show up either online or in person at the FDA and share their experience from anywhere in the world. It's not limited only to US. And so if you are joining us from anywhere outside of the US, please see how you can inform your own community to join these patient-focused drug development sessions. And when we look at the clinical assessments or outcomes of patients, they form primarily in these 4 major buckets, right? Patient-reported outcomes, observer reported outcomes, which is usually a caregiver, like a parent or a caregiver in the family, clinician reported outcome, and performance outcomes. So all these outcomes can be critical, but particularly for patient registries and patient experience, observer and patient reported outcomes are critical. And this requires online, digital, easy to use apps where patients can share their experience. It should not require traveling within the country or outside the country for collecting this data. It should be very easy. As long as they have access to a digital device and internet, I shouldn't say it's very easy. Sometimes the digital divide exists, and for some families that might be a challenge. But it still improves the access to a majority of people who may have access to these devices and internet. And if you look at the Genetic Information Center and at the NIH puts out a toolkit to help make creation of registries very easy and simple. And there is the key considerations while setting up a registry is to be very clear on the intended use or purpose. And what are the key considerations in selecting a patient registry tool to make sure we are setting it up the right way, right from the beginning, because it's very hard to go back and make changes, especially once the informed consent has been done. Any changes that may require reconsenting the patients becomes a barrier and hurdle, as many patients may just not feel engaged and they may drop out. So very important to start with clear intended purpose. Data entered by clinicians, patients, or both should be supported with a institutional review board or ethics committee. Review is very important, and obtaining informed consent about how the data will be shared and used down the road is critical. Because the primary intent of the registry, in my opinion, should be to have patients' data to be shared and utilized for research purposes and for potentially enrolling in future clinical trials. If that purpose is not met, then the registry may not be as valuable, right? And especially if the registries are set up to be global in scale or multinational in scale, we need to ensure the data privacy and regulations in all these countries are also adhered to. And most important is human-centered design. Because we expect patients to directly engage and share data, it needs to be very easy to use for people from anywhere with different languages, cultures, and race and PHUSE, which is a data science community, has put out standard guidelines for starting a patient registry, which I thought is very helpful. So I have put this up here. I'm happy to share all these slides. I think the organizers already have them, and they can share it with all of you if you are interested in having a copy of this. And important to have checklists, because this is an activity which involves meticulous, careful verification of every step of this process. And so we can't really miss anything. And so it helps to have a checklist when we are starting on this journey. So to really achieve this global diversity, equity, inclusion, and access for all patients affected by rare diseases, irrespective of their geographic location, it takes one, regulatory policy guidelines and mandates. Like the US Orphan Drug Act certainly has had enormous impact in resulting in about 1,100 orphan drugs. And the Inflation Reduction Act just celebrated its first anniversary this month, and that is having a great impact on drug pricing controls in the US, the 21st Century Cures Act, and various amendments of these acts. These are not just one time. They realize as they start implementing these policies, they will need to make some amendments to make it work. So many success stories which resulted from first having a governmental policy. That's very important. And when we look at it from a global lens, we need more international guidelines and communities like the ICH, Belmont Report, Helsinki Declaration, and we have standards such as CDISC and SDTM for clinical data, standards. PHUSE has been growing as a community. And so these cross-border collaborations are very critical. And we need more such guidelines for how to truly set up global registries, global clinical trials, and have more engagement from across the borders. Commitment among all stakeholders with a shared goal, and really getting the industry, patient groups, regulators, government bodies all to come together and understand each other's perspectives to make this work. And developing inclusive digital and data platforms, right? Like the demographic data for all the diverse parameters, prevalence, incidence, epidemiology, and the digital platforms that support different languages, cultures, religions, and can take those into account, because most of the software platforms coming from mostly the US and Europe are built primarily for the English-speaking Western population. And we need to make sure these platforms are more inclusive of other languages as well when we talk about rare diseases. And this global thinking among all stakeholders is critical. And of course, training and education program for cultural competency would be critical. In this regard, I ended founding the Indo-US Organization for Rare Diseases, which with the mission to connect the Indian diaspora in particular, who suffer from rare diseases, to research and clinical trials globally. I am located here in Northern Virginia for the last 23 years, and but I see that India has now become the most populous country in the world, and the Indian diaspora is the most populous population. And so and they are still heavily underrepresented. If you look at the population, it's about 15% of the world population, but represents 2% of clinical trial participants globally across all disease areas. So 6 times or 5 times underrepresentation of these Indian population in clinical research. So the key here is this patient concierge that I mentioned. That's in the title of my talk, is the tech-enabled patient concierge. What this does is essentially allows for patients who find us organically on the internet or through word-of-mouth referral. Patients can submit a online request. It could be a family member, and provide a consent online through e-consent for us to share that information to other partners, experts, and researchers to help the patient in specific areas that that patient is seeking assistance right now, depending on where they are in that patient journey. If you remember from the first slide, because every patient need might be unique, they may be battling the disease in a different phase of the journey. And so we need to see where exactly the patient needs assistance. So it's truly patient focused, one patient focused at a time. And so we have a staff members who get together internally, discuss all the requests on a bi-weekly basis, and deliver a comprehensive set of suggestions on, here are all the connections we will make for you. Here are the potential clinical trials you could enroll, or if they need diagnosis, what is the best diagnostic lab or physician that they should contact to obtain that diagnosis, and guide them, essentially care navigation service. Sometimes patients contact us for getting financial assistance, and we have some partnerships and collaborations where we can make referrals for crowdfunding at a discounted price discounted cost of obtaining that crowdfunding, and other patient advocate foundation and other partners who have various financial schemes to help patients with rare disease in US and India, but also to some degree for others as well. Then we have the Patient Foundation Alliance, where we have member organizations from various countries, and corporate alliance program where orphan drug companies are joining as a corporate member. Research programs, funded grant-funded programs, as a number of our board members and team members are PhDs and medical doctors and scientists. We get involved in research projects as well. This is a list of the patient advocacy groups that are working with us, both from US and India. We make cross connections. Sometimes organizations from Europe and other countries have also joined, who, as Indian diaspora is spread globally. So when you look at it from a clinical trial operations perspective, we asked what is the key challenge in clinical trials? Why is it so slow and expensive? Number one thing is patient recruitment and retention. Finding and enrolling patients is hard. If the registry exists, it's a good part of the solution, right? But there are certain diseases like muscular dystrophy where there are 5-10 companies or even 197 clinical trials that are going on for ALS that I showed, right? We can't have enough patients in US or Europe to enroll in all those 197 clinical trials, and that's where the competition becomes. And hence, if we can have global patient recruitment and retention efforts, that can help solve the problem. So I'm trying to connect the problems we heard from the customers and from the clinical trial industry to the solutions that we design in implementing them. Managing protocol complexity and amendments is another thing we heard, is especially in rare diseases. FDA has been quite flexible in allowing unique and new trial designs. It does not have to follow the same traditional pathway of going from phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, or have like randomized controlled clinical trials, which may require hundreds or thousands of patients, because some trials may not be run even with one patient with a rare disease. There are examples where a clinical trial was run on a new antisense oligo treatment with just one patient in that clinical trial. I think 2 or 3 such examples exist. And so allowing for various complex protocol designs to be supported during a clinical trial operations. Manual repetitive tasks frustrates a lot of users, because we heard every clinical trial feels like the first ever trial undertaken by mankind. It's like building a brand new airport for every plane to take off, because each plane is different. So that argument has led to a lot of inefficiency and manual work, frustrating all users involved, like the physician investigators, nurse coordinators, or sponsors and CROs that may be involved in a clinical trial. And the numerous point solutions is another frustration we heard. There is a tool for electronic data, for patient-reported outcomes, another for telemedicine, another for e-consent, and so on. So we designed a solution and to help this clinical operations leaders in orphan drugs, as well as for common indications, how to get this elephant to move, right? The elephant is not moving because there is so many moving parts going on. It's hard to get all the pieces together in this puzzle. So the protocol complexity occurs due to the protocol itself, like I described, but also the operational aspects, like can the patients travel to the sites, or do we need to engage patients where they are located? Okay, does unexpected change should occur during the course of a clinical trial, like a pandemic or some forest fire or something else for some patients? How do we make sure continuity of that study with patients being remote? Those are some examples, right? And so essentially, when we look at every activity that needs to occur in a clinical trial between the investigator site and patients, like patient education, obtaining informed consent, screening the patients, enrolling and obtaining clinical assessments throughout a clinical study, which may go on for 1, 2, or 3 years, we need to ensure patients remain engaged throughout that duration, even after the treatment phase is completed, for data collection between those visits, follow-up visits, and monitoring for adverse events or concomitant medications. So essentially, what gap we found was a single unified platform that could make all these activities simple, easy in one login, so they don't have to log into 30 different tools to make one study successful. And that's basically the solution we built at the Jiva Informatics Solutions over the last 4.5 years. And we are now really honored to be supporting multiple clinical trials, patient registries, both in US and in India at the moment. And the platform itself is built for global adoption of this. And so essentially now we put that difficult elephant into a happy elephant with the person in charge of, or the manager or the director of a patient registry or a clinical trial in the driver's seat. So the whole elephant could move forward with at the fingertips, because this application works from anywhere on a browser with one-time upfront configuration and setup, which our team helps, and then the team can execute on an ongoing basis. And it's all in one place, centralized, and so you don't need. There's no need for multiple a la carte tools. And of course, having various regulatory, data security, privacy, compliance is very critical in a platform like this. And a platform that was built by taking into account firsthand from 4,000 stakeholders of clinical trials who described their problems, frustrations, and gaps in the current tools that they have been using, has helped us ensure that this actually meets the needs of patients and the clinicians both. So coming back to that same platform is empowering this patient concierge, right? Which essentially enables patients to request remotely, receive help remotely through telemedicine, through questionnaires and surveys, through electronic diaries that they can maintain, or receive text messages, email, audio call directly on the browser, anywhere where voice over IP is supported, is all being delivered in that fashion. So remote patient concierge. Ask us if you are know a patient or family affected by a rare disease, they can go to this website or scan this QR code and then start submitting a request, and then our staff members will start contacting and providing free assistance. This is a free program as part of the nonprofit organization, so no cost for the patients. And there are several articles that you can refer to on how the FDA is really encouraging and inspiring confidence in decentralized clinical trials with new guidances that they have provided. And the emerging and mid-market biopharma companies is where most of the innovation occurs, right? And they suffer from these costly clinical trial delays. Every day that the drug is getting delayed, patients are waiting, patients are dying. And also for the pharma companies, they don't want delays either. It's costing a lot of money for them as well, in lost revenue or in operating cost to keep the lights on as day by day things get delayed. So it's in everybody's interest to minimize those costly delays and accelerate this process to the maximum extent possible. So with this patient concierge, we get requests, like I said, for various aspects, and depending on the type of access to expert opinion and access to treatment tend to be the most common requests that we receive. So this is a study we conducted in collaboration with the RareX group to understand the feasibility of patient-owned data registries in India. This is a free report that you all can download and access from the website, or I can share it. So please email me or download it from the website. We are also working closely with Rare Disease Diversity Coalition in leading the state of diversity, equity, inclusion, and access in rare disease research and clinical trials. We will be coming up with a report in the next 6 months. And recently, when I spoke at a conference in India, emphasizing the need for a patient registry for ALS in particular, that got covered in the largest daily newspaper in the world, Times of India, which chose to publish and highlight among various talks that were given at that conference. The need for patient registry was the one that they thought was most relevant to highlight in this press release that the editors wrote. And this has about 500 million people subscribing to this daily newspaper. And this was the second annual international conference that occurred. This is my last slide. I conclude this talk by inviting each one of you to attend this Indo-US Bridging Rare Summit. We are putting this in-person event for the first time here in Arlington, Virginia at George Mason University. This will be in October 29th and 30th. The goal here is to bring key stakeholders from both United States and India together under one roof to discuss key cross-border patient engagement concerns and any regulatory barriers, care pathway differences, what can we learn from each other and foster cross-border collaborations. We measure the key metrics of the organizational impact on the number of patient members, corporate members, individual patients that we are able to help through the patient concierge. So together we can expedite the whole global engagement in rare disease research, registries, and clinical trials because patients are waiting. So let's collaborate and make this happen. And my contact information is here, and I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has. Thank you so much again for the opportunity.